A roof does two things. It keeps the weather out and it holds itself up. These two jobs are not equally difficult. Keeping the weather out is a problem of materials. Any surface that water cannot penetrate will keep rain and snow off the people beneath it. A tin sheet works. A stretched canvas works. A layer of sod on boards works, at least until the sod dries and cracks, or the boards rot from the moisture that the sod traps against them. Almost anything works as a barrier between the sky and the floor, at least for a while. Holding itself up is a different problem entirely, and it is the problem that kills people. A roof must support its own weight, plus the weight of whatever lands on it. And in the mountain valleys of the Idaho Territory in the 1880s, what landed on it was snow. Not the light dry powder snow that blows off a roof as fast as it falls. Mountain snow. Wet, heavy snow that packs down under its own weight and bonds to itself and forms a dense slab that grows thicker with every storm and does not leave until spring. Snow weighs between 7 and 20 pounds per cubic foot depending on its density, and a roof measuring 20 feet by 14 feet with 2 feet of packed snow on it is carrying between 3,900 and 11,200 pounds. The low end of that range is nearly 2 tons. The high end is more than 5 tons of dead weight pressing straight down on a structure made of logs and planks and nails, a structure that was built in a hurry by people who needed shelter before winter and who did not have time to calculate snow loads or engineer their rafters to handle 5 tons of anything. The standard frontier cabin roof in the Idaho Territory was a low-pitch design, typically between 15 and 25 degrees from horizontal. This was not an engineering decision. It was an economy decision. A low-pitch roof uses less lumber. The rafters are shorter. The ridge beam is lower. The walls do not need to be as tall. A man working alone or with one helper can raise a low-pitch roof in 2 days. A steep roof takes 4 days and twice the lumber and requires walls that go up another 4 to 6 feet above the standard height, which means more logs to fell and notch and lift into place. On the frontier, where time and lumber and labor were all in short supply, the low-pitch roof won every argument. It was cheaper, it was faster, it was easier, and it collected snow the way a bowl collects water, because a roof at 20 degrees does not shed snow. Snow slides off a surface only when gravity's pull along the slope exceeds the friction between the snow and the roofing material. On a rough surface like sod or raw planks, that angle is somewhere around 35 to 40 degrees. Below that angle, the snow sits. It accumulates. It packs. It grows heavier with each storm, and the roof groans under it, and the rafters bow. And one morning in February, the family inside wakes to a sound like a gunshot as the ridge beam cracks and the whole structure folds inward, and 2 tons of snow and broken timber come down on whatever is beneath them. This happened in the Bitterroot Valley every winter, not once, not as a freak occurrence, as a regular event, as predictable as the snow itself, as certain as the fact that a 20-degree roof covered in rough planks will hold snow until the snow breaks the roof. The settlement of Harlan Creek in the Bitterroot Mountains of Idaho Territory lost 2 roofs in the winter of 1885, 3 in the winter of 1886, and 1 in the winter of 1887. 6 roofs in 3 winters. Nobody was killed, which was luck rather than engineering, because the collapses happened during daylight when most people were outside working, not at 3 in the morning when the family would have been sleeping directly beneath the failing ridge beam. But the damage was severe. A collapsed roof meant rebuilding in the middle of winter, which meant working in snow and cold with frozen lumber and numb hands, which meant a structure even less sound than the one that had failed, which meant another collapse the following winter, or the winter after that. It was a cycle of failure that repeated itself because the settlement kept building the same roof that kept failing, and nobody questioned the design because the design was all anyone knew. Nadia Petrova questioned the design on the morning of October 14th, 1887, which was the morning she and Fyodor arrived in the Bitterroot Valley after 11 days on a freight wagon from Boise. She stood in the back of the wagon, looking at the settlement spread along the creek bottom, and she saw the roofs immediately. Low, flat, dark with sod, or gray with weathered planks. Roofs that she recognized instantly as structures that would not survive the kind of snow that accumulated in a mountain valley between October and April, because she had grown up in a place where the snow was worse and where the people who survived were the people who had learned, over centuries, that a roof must shed its load or be crushed by it. Nadia was born in the village of Tunka, in the Tunka Valley of eastern Siberia, at the foot of the Sayan Mountains, near the southern shore of Lake Baikal. The Tunka Valley is in many ways a twin of the Bitterroot Valley, a narrow trough between high mountain ridges, cold, forested, with heavy snowfall from October through May, and temperatures that routinely dropped to 40 below. The people of the Tunka Valley had been building in this environment for generations, and the structures they built reflected a set of solutions that had been refined by trial and failure over centuries. The most important of those solutions was the roof. In the Tunka Valley, roofs were steep, not slightly steep, radically steep, 45 to 55 degrees from horizontal, pitched at an angle that looked excessive to anyone from a milder climate, an angle that made the cabin look more like a tent than a house, the roof rising sharply from the walls to a high, narrow ridge that cut the sky like the prow of a ship. The steep pitch was the first defense against snow load. At 45 degrees, gravity's pull along the slope exceeds the friction of any roofing material, which means snow slides off as fast as it accumulates. A 45-degree roof does not carry snow. It sheds it. The snow lands, it slides, it piles up on the ground beside the cabin instead of on the cabin, and the roof carries only its own weight, plus a brief transient load that lasts minutes rather than months. But the pitch alone was not enough. A steep roof sheds snow, but a steep roof covered in rough planks or sod still has too much surface friction to shed reliably in the critical temperature range between 28 and 32 degrees, when the snow is wet and heavy and sticky and bonds to rough surfaces the way paste bonds to paper. To shed wet snow, the roofing surface had to be smooth, not planed lumber smooth, bark smooth. The roofs in the Tunka Valley were covered in beresta, birch bark, harvested in large sheets from mature birch trees in late spring when the sap was running and the bark separated cleanly from the wood in flexible sheets up to 4 feet wide and 8 feet long. The sheets were layered on the roof like fish scales, each row overlapping the row below by 6 inches, the smooth outer surface of the bark facing up, creating a continuous surface with the texture of polished leather. Wet snow could not grip it. Ice could not bond to it. Rain ran off it like water off oiled cloth. The bark was waterproof because birch bark contains betulin, a waxy compound that fills the cells of the outer bark and makes it naturally impervious to moisture, a property so reliable that birch bark has been used for canoes, water containers, and roofing for thousands of years across the entire northern hemisphere. In the Tunka Valley, a beresta roof on a 45-degree pitch would shed a foot of wet snow in under an hour. The snow would land on the bark surface, begin to slide immediately, and sheet off the roof in a slow-motion avalanche that piled up on the ground in a ridge along the eaves line. The cabin beneath carried no snow load. None. Zero. While the flat-roofed structures in lower elevations groaned and cracked under tons of accumulated weight, the steep bark roofs of the Tunka Valley stood clear and light and dry, their ridge beams unstressed, their rafters carrying nothing heavier than the bark shingles themselves. Nadia learned the bark craft from her mother, who had learned it from her mother before her, a line of knowledge that went back further than anyone in the family could trace. By the time she was 14, Nadia could strip birch bark in clean sheets without tearing, sort the sheets by thickness and flexibility, and lay a watertight roof course faster than her older brother. Her mother said she had the hands for it, which was the highest compliment a bark worker in the Tunka Valley could receive, and which meant that Nadia's fingers understood the grain of the bark the way a weaver's fingers understand the grain of cloth, instinctively, without having to think about which direction to pull or how much pressure to apply. She married Fyodor Petrov at 19. He was a timber cutter from a village 30 versts up the valley, a quiet, serious man who could fell a larch tree within a handspan of where he intended it to land, and who could read the grain of a log the way Nadia could read the grain of bark. They were, in the language of the valley, a matched pair, two people whose separate skills combined into a single competence that neither possessed alone. They left Siberia in 1884, not because they wanted to, but because the timber concession that employed Fyodor was sold to a company from Moscow that brought its own crews and had no use for local cutters. They went east to Vladivostok, then by ship to San Francisco, then by rail to Boise, then by freight wagon into the mountains, following rumors of cheap land and good timber in the territories. The same rumors that had drawn thousands of immigrants into the mountain valleys of the American West in the 1880s. They arrived in the Bitterroot Valley with $42, a trunk of tools, and the knowledge in their hands. She saw failure waiting to happen. She saw the same flat, heavy designs that had killed people in every mountain settlement she had ever heard of. The same engineering mistake repeated by people who did not know there was another way. She turned to Fyodor and said, in Russian, "We will not build a roof like those." Fyodor, who had spent 20 years as a timber cutter in the forests east of Irkutsk, and who had lived under beresta roofs his entire life, looked at the settlement and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. They both knew what the roofs should look like. The question was whether they could build one here. The Bitterroot Valley had birch, but not the paper birch of Siberia, whose bark peeled in wide, clean sheets. The birch here was water birch, a smaller species with thinner bark that did not separate as easily and could not be harvested in sheets wider than 2 feet. This was the problem that Fyodor solved. He was a timberman. He knew wood the way Nadia knew bark, from the inside out, and he looked at the forests of the Bitterroot and saw what Nadia could not. The valley had no Siberian birch, but it had western red cedar, and the bark of a mature western red cedar was thick, fibrous, naturally saturated with oils that repelled water, and could be stripped from the trunk in long slabs 3 to 4 feet wide and up to 6 feet long. Cedar bark was not birch bark. It was rougher, more fibrous, less smooth. But Fyodor understood something about wood fiber that came from 20 years of cutting and splitting and shaping timber with hand tools. He knew that if you soaked cedar bark in water for 3 days and then pressed it flat under heavy stones for a week, The outer fibers compressed, and the surface became dense and smooth. Not birch bark, smooth but close. Smooth enough that the natural oils in the cedar would create a surface that wet snow could not grip. The soaking and pressing transformed rough, fibrous cedar bark into something that behaved on a steep roof, almost exactly like beresta. It would shed snow, it would shed rain, and it would last, because cedar bark resists rot the way no other wood in the northern forests can. The oils that make it waterproof also making it poisonous to the fungi and insects that destroy other wood in a matter of years. Nadia knew the design. Fyodor knew the material. Between them, they had a roof. Their cabin went up in October and November of 1887 with help from two neighbors, Garrett Lund and his eldest, who provided the extra hands needed to raise the walls to the height that a steep roof required. The walls were standard peeled log, 8 inches in diameter, notched and stacked, 9 courses high, which brought the wall height to 6 feet at the eaves. This was 2 courses higher than the standard cabin in Harlan Creek, and Garrett Lund commented on it. "You are wasting logs," he said. "These walls are too tall." "They will not be too tall when the roof goes on," Nadia said. The roof frame was built of peeled Douglas fir poles, 6 inches at the butt, tapering to 4 inches at the tip, set as rafters at 24-inch centers. The ridge beam was a single Douglas fir log, 8 inches in diameter, running the full 20-foot length of the cabin. The pitch was 47 degrees, measured by Nadia using a plumb line and a protractor that she had brought from Irkutsk, wrapped in oiled cloth in the bottom of her trunk, a tool that her father had used to set the roof angles on every structure he built in the Tunka Valley and that she had inherited when he died. 47 degrees. The rafters rose steeply from the wall plates to the ridge, and the roof peak stood 14 feet above the floor, giving the cabin a silhouette that looked nothing like anything else in the settlement. It looked, to the people of Harlan Creek, like a church steeple or the prow of a ship or possibly a mistake. Floyd Henning said it first. Henning ran the sawmill at the lower end of the valley, and he sold milled lumber to every homesteader in the settlement, and he had a professional interest in roof design, because every roof in the valley was built with his planks, and every collapsed roof was rebuilt with more of his planks, and he did not, if he was honest with himself, want to see a design that did not require his lumber. "That is a waste of good timber," Henning said, standing at the edge of the Petrov lot with his arms crossed, looking at the steep frame rising against the gray sky. "You have used twice the rafter length you need. The ridge is 6 feet higher than it needs to be. And what are you going to cover it with?" "Bark," Nadia said. She was on the roof at the time, straddling the ridge beam, fitting a collar tie between 2 rafters. She did not look down. "Bark," Henning repeated. He looked at Fyodor, who was splitting cedar bark slabs on the ground below. Fyodor did not look up. "Bark will not hold," Henning said. "The wind will strip it. The frost will crack it. By January, you will be buying my planks." Nadia said nothing. She tied off the collar tie and moved to the next rafter pair. If you want to know what happened when a woman from the coldest valley in Siberia brought 4 centuries of mountain roofing to an Idaho settlement that lost 6 roofs in 3 winters, subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. Fyodor had been preparing the bark since September. He had walked the slopes above the valley for 3 days before he found what he was looking for, moving through the forest with the slow, deliberate pace of a man who is reading trees the way a jeweler reads stones, looking for specific signs of age and health and bark quality that only a lifetime of timber work could teach him to recognize. He needed mature western red cedars with a trunk diameter of 24 inches or more. bark thickness of 3/4 of an inch to 1 inch, and no visible signs of disease or insect damage that would have compromised the bark's integrity. He marked 8 trees with a blaze from his hatchet and returned to the valley. The stripping began on September 20th. Fyodor used a hand-forged spud, a flat-bladed tool shaped like a wide chisel that he slid between the bark and the sapwood and levered outward, peeling the bark away from the trunk in sheets that came off with a sound like tearing cloth. The technique required patience and a feel for the grain of the bark. Push too hard and the sheet split along a weak line and you lost half the slab. Push too gently and the bark bonded back to the sapwood and you had to start again. Fyodor worked slowly, methodically, his hands reading the resistance of the bark the way a fisherman reads the resistance of a line, adjusting his pressure constantly, feeling for the point where the bark wanted to separate, and following that line of least resistance down the trunk. Each tree yielded 6 to 8 slabs, averaging 3 feet wide and 5 feet long. The slabs were rough on the outer surface, fibrous, covered in the stringy reddish-brown bark that gives western red cedar its name. Fyodor soaked them in the creek, weighted down with stones for 3 days. The soaking softened the fibers and allowed the natural oils in the cedar to migrate toward the outer surface, concentrating them in the layer that would face the weather. Then he pulled them out and stacked them in a press he had built from 2 flat logs and 4 wooden wedges, the bark slabs layered between the logs and the wedges driven in to compress them under approximately 500 pounds of pressure per square foot. The slabs stayed in the press for 7 days. When he removed them, the transformation was visible immediately. The rough, fibrous outer surface had compressed into a dense, smooth layer. The fibers flattened and interlocked. The natural cedar oils pressed to the surface, where they formed a waxy sheen that beaded water when Fyodor poured a cup of creek water across the surface. He ran his hand over the bark. Smooth, dense, almost slippery. Not beresta, but close enough. He brought a slab to Nadia, and she tested it the way her mother had tested bark in the Tunka Valley, by holding it at an angle and pouring water slowly across the surface and watching how the water moved. On rough bark, water finds channels between the fibers and soaks in. On properly prepared bark, water sheets across the surface in an unbroken film and runs off the lower edge without penetrating. The water sheeted. Nadia nodded. "This will work," she said. Nadia laid the bark on the roof in the Siberian pattern. She started at the eaves and worked upward toward the ridge, laying each slab horizontally with the smooth pressed surface facing up, overlapping each row over the row below by 6 inches, fastening each slab to the roof, battens with hand-carved wooden pegs driven through pre-bored holes. No nails. Nails would rust and leave holes that leaked. Wooden pegs swelled when wet, sealing their own holes, and they did not corrode. Each peg was carved from dry cedar heartwood, 1 inch in diameter, tapered to a blunt point, driven into a 3/4 inch hole bored through the bark and the batten beneath. When the peg absorbed moisture from rain or snow, it swelled to fill the hole completely, creating a fastening that was watertight and permanent. The total number of bark slabs was 94. The total number of pegs was over 600. The total time to lay the bark was 12 days, working from dawn to dusk. Nadia on the roof and Fyodor below handing up slabs and preparing pegs. The total material cost was $1.60, 40 cents for the creek soaking weights, which were heavy rope lashings purchased from the Henning mill, 70 cents for the draw knife blade that Fyodor had purchased in Boise to replace the one that had broken during the bark stripping. 50 cents for 2 pounds of beeswax that Nadia melted and brushed along the overlap seams of the bark courses as a final waterproofing measure, a technique from the Tunka Valley that sealed the joints where water might wick upward between overlapping sheets by capillary action. Everything else was free. The cedar bark came from the forest. The pegs came from cedar scraps. The battens came from split saplings. $1.60 for a roof. Floyd Henning's milled plank roofing, by comparison, cost $14 for the same square footage, plus nails at 8 cents a pound, plus the sod or tar paper that most settlers laid over the planks as a moisture barrier, another $3 to $4. The Petrov's bark roof had cost 1/10 of a plank roof, and it was better. Henning did not believe it was better. He came by the cabin in late November after the bark was laid and looked at the finished roof from the ground. The dark reddish-brown bark shingles overlapped in neat rows from eaves to ridge, the surface smooth and uniform, the seams tight and sealed with beeswax. It looked, Henning had to admit, like a proper roof, but it was bark. It was not lumber. It was not the product of his mill. And the steep pitch was absurd, a waste of vertical space that served no purpose that Henning could see. A roof that steep will catch the wind, he said. First big storm, the wind will get under those bark sheets and peel them off like pages from a book. Nadia, who was inside the cabin at the time stacking firewood, heard him through the wall and said nothing. The first snow came on November 29th, 1887. 4 inches of dry powder. The bark roof held it for approximately 20 minutes. Then the snow began to slide, slowly at first, then faster as the layer between the bark surface and the snowpack lost friction, and within an hour, the entire load had sheeted off the roof and landed in a ridge along both sides of the cabin. The roof was bare, clean, dark bark steaming faintly in the cold air as the residual warmth from inside the cabin evaporated the trace moisture left behind. Across the settlement, 4 inches of snow sat on every other roof, pressing down, packing, beginning the slow accumulation that would continue until spring. Garrett Lund saw it happen. He was outside splitting kindling when the snow slid off the Petrov roof in a slow white curtain, and he stopped with the hatchet in his hand and watched the entire event, which took about 4 minutes from the first movement at the ridge to the last clump sliding off the eaves. He looked at his own roof, where 4 inches of snow sat motionless on the 20-degree plank surface, and he looked at the Petrov roof, which was bare and dark and clean, and he did not say anything to anyone, but that night at dinner he told Hazel, "Their roof shed the snow." Hazel said, "That is what she said it would do." Lund said, "Yes." December came, and the snow kept coming. 8 inches on December 4th, 6 inches on December 12th, 11 inches on December 19th and 20th combined. By Christmas, there was 29 inches of accumulated snow on every flat roof in the settlement, compacted by its own weight into a dense slab approximately 14 inches thick and weighing between 12 and 16 pounds per cubic foot. On the Petrov cabin, there was nothing. Each snowfall landed and slid and piled up on the ground, and the roof stood bare. Nadia swept the shed snow away from the cabin walls every few days with a shovel to prevent it from piling up to the eaves, but that was the only maintenance the roof required. No shoveling the roof, no climbing up with a rake to pull the snow off before it got too heavy. No lying awake at night listening to the rafters creak and wondering if tonight was the night the ridge beam would let go. The roof was silent because the roof was empty. January brought the cold. 12 below on January 3rd, 18 below on the 7th, 22 below on the 15th, with a wind that drove the effective temperature down to a number that no one in the settlement wanted to calculate. The cold did two things to the snow on the flat roofs. It bonded the layers together into a single dense mass that could not be dislodged even by shoveling, and it contracted the wood of the rafters, shrinking the lumber by a fraction of an inch per foot, which opened the joints and reduced the overall structural strength of the roof frame by a margin that was small in theory and catastrophic in practice. A rafter that was strong enough to hold 1,500 pounds in October was strong enough to hold only 1,200 pounds in January, because the cold had shrunk the wood and loosened the nails and opened hairline gaps in the joints that allowed the structure to flex under load in ways it had not been designed to flex. By the end of January, every flat roof in Harlan Creek was carrying between 3,000 and 4,000 pounds of compacted snow on a structure that was weaker than it had been when the snow started falling. The margins were gone. The safety factor was gone. The roofs were holding because wood is forgiving and because no single event had yet pushed the load past the absolute failure point. But the failure point was close and getting closer with every inch of new snow. Nadia watched the other roofs through January with the quiet dread of someone who knows what is coming and cannot stop it. She mentioned it to Fyodor one evening, sitting by the fire, both of them listening to the silence that comes when snow muffles every sound in a mountain valley. "The Lund roof is carrying 4,000 pounds, she said, maybe more. Fyodor said nothing. He was stitching a torn boot with an awl and waxed thread, and his hands did not stop moving. She said, "His ridge beam is 8 inches. 8 inches of Douglas fir with a 17-foot span. I can hear it from here." She could not actually hear it from inside her own cabin, but she could hear it when she walked past the Lund cabin on the path to the creek, a low groaning sound that came from the roof when the wind shifted the snow load even slightly, the voice of a beam that was past its comfortable working range and into the territory where one more storm, one heavy, wet storm, would be the end. She had heard that sound before. In the Tunka Valley, the flat-roofed storage sheds that some of the newer families built, families that did not listen to the old women who told them to build steep, made that sound in late winter, just before they folded. It was the sound of wood remembering that it was once a tree, and a tree bends before it breaks, and the bending has a voice, and the voice says, "I am almost done holding this up." She considered going to Lund and telling him to shovel his roof. She considered going to Henning and telling him that his mill shed was 30 days from collapse. She did neither because she had already told them what kind of roof to build, and they had chosen not to listen. And there is a limit to how many times you can tell a person that their house is wrong before you become the person that nobody wants to talk to. 4 inches is nothing. 4 inches is 1,400 pounds on a standard 20 by 14 cabin roof. 1,400 pounds is nothing in November. But November becomes December, and December becomes January, and 4 inches becomes 12 inches, becomes 24 inches, and 1,400 pounds becomes 4,000 pounds, becomes 8,000 pounds. And the ridge beam that held 1,400 pounds without complaint does not hold 8,000 pounds without cracking. And by February, the family is sleeping under a structure that is 3,000 pounds past its failure point. And the only thing preventing collapse is the fact that the wood has not yet found the grain line along which it will split. It finds that line at 3 in the morning or at noon or during breakfast. It finds it without warning, and the sound is a crack like a rifle shot, and then a groan, and then a roar as 2 months of accumulated snow and the broken remains of a roof come down on everything beneath. Nadia's roof never carried more than a few minutes of snowfall at a time. Storm after storm, the snow landed and the snow slid, and the roof stood bare and dry under a load of nothing. December passed. January passed. February arrived, and on February 11th, 1888, the storm that Nadia had been waiting for without knowing she was waiting for it came down from the north. It was not the biggest storm the Bitterroot Valley had ever seen, but it was the heaviest. Wet, dense snow driven by a south wind that pushed the temperature to just above freezing, the worst possible conditions for a low-pitch roof, because wet snow at 31 degrees is the stickiest substance in nature, bonding to rough surfaces like glue, packing under its own weight into a dense slab that can reach 20 pounds per cubic foot. The storm lasted 14 hours. It dropped 26 inches of wet snow. On a standard 20 by 14 cabin roof at 20 degrees pitch, 26 inches of wet snow at 20 pounds per cubic foot is a load of approximately 10,100 pounds, 5 tons, on a roof that was built to hold perhaps 3. 6 roofs collapsed in Harlan Creek on the night of February 11th and the morning of February 12th. The first went at 11 at night, the Garrett Lund cabin, the ridge beam splitting with a crack that his wife Hazel heard from inside and screamed, and they were out the door with their eldest before the roof came down. The sound woke the Coogans next door, and Walt Coogan went outside in his boots and long johns and stood in the snow looking up at his own roof in the dark, and could hear it groaning, a low, continuous creaking sound that was the voice of wood, bending past the point where it could spring back, and he went inside and pulled his wife and their belongings out through the door, and the roof held another 3 hours and then let go at 2 in the morning with a sound like a tree falling. The third and fourth were the paired cabins of the Holt family, father and married son, living side by side, both roofs failing within minutes of each other just before dawn. The snow on one roof sliding sideways off the collapsing structure and landing on the other roof, and the combined weight folding both cabins inward like paper boxes crushed by a boot. The fifth was the hay barn behind the Danziger homestead, a total loss of 4 tons of stored hay that had been intended to feed their livestock through March. The Danzigers stood in the snow at dawn, watching their hay barn steaming under the snow, and Elsa Danziger said nothing, and then said, "The horses will starve." And Danziger said nothing because there was nothing to say that would make it untrue. The sixth was Floyd Henning's sawmill shed, a plank-roofed structure that Henning himself had built with his own lumber, his own design, his own confident understanding of what a roof needed to be. 10,000 pounds of wet snow folded it like a sheet of paper. Nobody was killed. This was luck. The collapses happened in the small hours when people were either awake from the noise of earlier collapses or close enough to their doors that the sound of cracking wood gave them seconds to move. The Lund family lost everything inside the cabin. The Coogans saved their cook stove and a trunk of clothing and nothing else. The Holts salvaged tools and bedding from beneath the broken rafters, but both cabins were destroyed beyond repair. They moved in with neighbors, crowding 2 families into spaces built for one, sharing food that was already rationed for winter, while outside the valley lay under nearly 3 feet of new snow, and the temperature dropped back below 0, and the work of rebuilding was impossible until the weather broke. Nadia and Fyodor's roof held, not struggled, not bent or groaned or bowed under the load. Held, because there was no load to hold. The wet, heavy snow had landed on the pressed cedar bark surface at 47 degrees and had slid off as fast as it accumulated, sheeting down both sides of the roof in continuous slow-motion avalanches that built ridges of snow 4 feet high along the eaves lines. The cabin inside was warm and dry and quiet. The ridge beam was unstressed. The rafters were carrying nothing but bark and air. Nadia heard the loon cabin go from inside her own cabin. She heard the crack and the roar, and she knew immediately what the sound was because she had heard it before in the Tunka Valley when a flat-roofed storage shed behind a neighbor's house had collapsed under spring snow when she was 12 years old. She woke Fyodor. They dressed and went out into the storm and spent the rest of the night helping the Lund family salvage what they could from the wreckage and carry it to the Petrov cabin, which was the only cabin in the immediate area with a roof that could be trusted. By morning, there were 11 people in the Petrov cabin, the Petrovs and the Lunds and the Coogan family, all of them sitting around the stone fireplace in a cabin that was dry and warm and whole beneath a roof that had not carried a single pound of snow all night. If this story has touched you, share it and subscribe, because these are the engineering solutions the history books forgot, and every share means one more person discovers what was possible with bark and angles and the memory of snow. Floyd Henning came to the Petrov cabin on February 14th, 3 days after the storm. He did not come to apologize, because Floyd Henning was not a man who apologized. He came to look at the roof. He stood in the snow beside the cabin and looked up at the dark bark surface, clean and bare, steaming faintly in the thin winter sun. He looked at the 4-foot ridges of snow piled along both sides of the cabin where the roof had shed its load. He looked at the eaves, the overlap pattern of the bark shingles, the wooden pegs, the beeswax-sealed seams. He looked for a long time. Then he looked at Nadia, who was standing in the doorway with her arms crossed, and he said, "How steep?" 47 degrees, she said. "How do you fasten the bark?" "Wooden pegs, cedar. They swell when wet. How long does the bark last?" "My father's roof in Siberia lasted 30 years. He replaced it once." Henning was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I have lost my mill shed." "I know," Nadia said. "I would like to rebuild it," Henning said. "I would like to rebuild it correctly." Nadia looked at Fyodor. Fyodor nodded. Nadia looked back at Henning. "I will show you," she said. The rebuilding started in March when the weather broke. Nadia supervised the construction of Henning's new mill shed roof, teaching his crew the Siberian pitch angle, the bark preparation method, the peg fastening system, and the beeswax sealing technique. Henning, to his credit, listened. He listened the way a man listens when his own roof has just proved him wrong, and someone else's roof has just proved them right, which is to say carefully and without interruption. The mill shed went up with a 45-degree bark roof. It held through the following winter without shedding a single shingle. Garrett Lund was next. His cabin had been destroyed in the February storm, and he had spent 6 weeks living with neighbors, sleeping on a floor with his wife Hazel and their eldest, eating other people's food and burning other people's wood, and owing a debt that grew heavier every day, even though no one asked him to repay it. When the snow melted enough to work, Lund rebuilt his cabin from the foundation up, and this time he went to Nadia before he set a single rafter. She walked him through the design, drawing the angles on a flat piece of bark with a charcoal stick, explaining the relationship between pitch and snow load in the patient, methodical way that her mother had explained it to her in the Tunka Valley when she was 12. 45 degrees minimum, she said. 47 is better. The rafters must be strong enough to support the bark and a worker standing on the roof, but they do not need to support snow because the snow will not stay. This changes everything about how you build a roof. You are not building a platform to hold weight. You are building a slope to shed it. Lund's new cabin went up in April with a 46-degree bark roof. Nadia and Fyodor helped with the bark preparation and laying, and Hazel Lund worked alongside Nadia on the roof, learning the overlap pattern, the peg spacing, the beeswax sealing. Hazel had strong hands from years of farm work, and she took to the bark laying with a confidence that surprised Nadia and did not surprise Hazel at all. "I have been mending things my whole life," Hazel said. "A roof is just another thing that needs mending." The Coogan cabin was rebuilt next, then the paired Holt cabins. Each one went up with a steep bark roof. Each one was cheaper than a plank roof and took roughly the same time to build once the bark was prepared. The bark preparation was the bottleneck. Stripping, soaking, pressing, and drying the cedar slabs took 3 weeks from start to finish, and the process required space and labor and attention that not every family could spare during the critical spring months when there was planting and livestock and 100 other demands on every pair of hands. Nadia solved this by organizing the bark preparation as a communal effort. 3 times during the spring and summer of 1888, she led work parties into the cedar groves on the upper slopes. Groups of 6 to 8 men and women who stripped bark, hauled it to the creek, laid it in soaking pools, and transferred it to the pressing frames that Fyodor built at a central site near the sawmill. The pressed bark was stacked and stored under a lean-to shelter available to any family that was ready to roof. The arrangement was simple, and it worked because Nadia made it work, organizing schedules, assigning tasks, checking the quality of the pressed bark with her fingers the way her mother had taught her, rejecting slabs that were too thin or unevenly compressed or cracked at the edges. She was not gentle about the quality checks. "A bad slab on a roof is worse than no slab," she told Coogan when he complained that she had rejected half his batch. "A bad slab leaks. A leak rots the batten. A rotted batten drops the slab. And then you have a hole in your roof in January, and you are buying Floyd Henning's planks to patch it. Use good bark or use no bark. There is nothing in between." By the spring of 1889, 4 more cabins in the settlement had been re-roofed with steep pitch bark shingle roofs, all of them built under Nadia's supervision or following the specifications she had written down in a small notebook and loaned to anyone who asked. The standard cost was between $1.50 and $2 per roof, depending on the distance to suitable cedar trees. The standard construction time was 10 to 14 days for 2 people. The standard lifespan, based on Nadia's experience in Siberia, was 25 to 30 years before the bark needed replacement. Henning adapted because Henning was a businessman, and a businessman survives by selling what people want to buy. He could not sell plank roofing to people who had watched plank roofs collapse and bark roofs stand. So he began selling milled battens and pre-cut rafter stock sized for steep pitch bark roofs, and he made more money per cabin on the framing lumber than he had ever made on plank roofing, because a steep roof uses longer rafters and more of them. He never admitted this to Nadia. She never asked. By 1891, Harlan Creek had not lost a single roof to snow collapse. Not one. The settlement that had lost 6 roofs in 3 winters before the Petrovs arrived had lost 0 in the 4 winters since. The difference was not luck. The difference was not a change in the weather. The difference was 47 degrees and cedar bark. a combination that took the most destructive force in the mountain environment and turned it into nothing, converted 5 tons of crushing weight into 5 tons of harmless snow, piled on the ground beside a cabin whose roof carried only its own weight and the thin, clean air of the Bitterroot Valley. The roof did not fight the snow. That was the thing that Nadia understood, and that the settlement had not understood until she showed them. You cannot fight snow. You cannot outbuild it or out-engineer it, or make a flat roof strong enough to hold it forever, because forever in a mountain valley is measured in storms, and every storm adds weight, and eventually the weight wins. You do not fight the snow, you let it go. You build a surface so steep and so smooth that the snow cannot stay, and it slides off, and the roof stands empty beneath a sky full of falling white, untouched, unburdened, holding nothing but the warmth of the family inside. No myths, no miracles, just bark, angles, and the memory of snow.